Danny.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to give you some reasons not to be despondent. And also to say, do not think that there is enormous unity amongst the elite. There can be an impression of unity until suddenly it snaps. I got one of my best education lessons in this city. I was here in the 1990s. I was in my 20s. And for those of you, some of you I can see were also here in the 1990s. You may have knocked on doors in 1997 for Labour. There were thousands of people knocking on doors in Bristol North West because the MP was William Waldegrave. And Labour went from third to first. That wasn't my education. My education was going to the Labour Party in 1997 and watching the big TV screen as the exit poll came up. And these hundreds of these thousands of people, hundreds, not thousands in the room, but still hundreds, saw the exit poll, realised it was going to be a landslide for Labour, and then Tony Blair's face appeared and the entire room erupted in boos. These were people who had campaigned for weeks to get Labour elected in 1997. They were mostly older than me and they knew. I didn't realise at the time what they knew. It became obvious fairly shortly after what Tony Blair would do, but they had put all that effort in despite knowing. I'm going to tell you one story you may not have heard of and then probably a couple that you have heard of before. The story I think you may not have heard of is the story of the radical revolutionary non-sectarian left from 1938. And sometimes we forget these stories, but I like this particular story, and I think it has reticence for today. I'm going to just limit myself to what happens among students in elite universities. In fact, in my elite university, the University of Oxford. And you may not know what the students did in 1938. They were campaigning against fascism and against genocide. I'll give you two examples. One, a revolutionary communist student bought a copy of a recently painted picture called Guernica and hung it up in the senior common room of the college that Boris Johnson went. And this was seen as a terrible thing to do. That revolutionary student, I think he was a communist at the time, was called Dennis Healy. He later became Chancellor of the Exchequer. But another group of students created a play which they enacted in which a concentration camp was built on Christchurch meadow in Oxford in 1938 to warn of what would come, particularly if the British allied with the Germans, because that was an option. And the student who wrote the play was called Iris Murdoch. And those are the only names that are remembered from 1938. Nobody remembers the university officials who tried to stop them. Nobody remembers at all any of that. And they were part of a success and a battle which was much wider than them, which went all the way from Cable Street through to Parliament, over do we side with Hitler or don't we side with Hitler. That was 1938. I'm determined not to run out of time, so I will jump forward quickly. Oh, that was the time of my grandfather as a student. That was what radicalised him. And also radicalised a young Harold Wilson, who was also a student at the same time. Jump forward to when my parents were radicalised, 1968. And again, the students were protesting. And we didn't join the war with America in Vietnam. And the Prime Minister at the time was Harold Wilson, who had been influenced by the activities of his contemporaries. Jump forward again to when I was a young student, right? Around 1988. And what was the battle then? And remember, these battles were won. This is the important thing. 1938 was won. The 1968, we're not going to take part in Vietnam, was won. The biggest protests that I attended in the 1980s were the anti-apartheid protests. And still those protests occur in elite universities like the one here, but like my own. At the end of every evening, when they have music in Wadham College in Oxford, somebody mentioned the specials earlier, At the end of every evening, by tradition, Free Nelson Mandela is played in an Oxford college to remember the protests and what happened at that time. And then go through to my children's political awakening, which is last year, which is the events that happened then, where in my city, roughly a dozen students were arrested and taken to police stations far outside the city and charged because they had protested. All the charges have been dropped. Who's going to be remembered in future? Will it be our registrar or our vice-chancellor or the other 11 people who signed a letter about them, other than for what they said and was it true? Or will it be those students and the continued protests in the University of Oxford? You can guess where the hearts and minds of the student body moved to the minute they were arrested. That was the moment at which the large majority of students at the University of Oxford knew which side they stood on. They didn't mean to get arrested, they didn't expect to get arrested. But the effect of that protest and where we are now means that there is a unanimity of view. Only a tiny minority do not see what is going on in Palestine as absolutely terrible. And they all know about it now because of what's happened. On that protest, what did actually happen? The organisation Liberty was founded, I think, way back in 1934 to investigate police collusion to attempt to disrupt the hunger strikes. And again, you might think it incredible that the police were involved in disrupting hunger strikes. And of course, now we just remember hunger strikes. Of course, people were marching to London because they were hungry. But the police were involved in attempts to frame people to stop that happening. So how were the police involved in university protests? Well, we know, because about a week ago, Liberty released the results of its investigation as to what the universities have been doing with the students. And they were published in The Guardian and on the Sky News websites. And there were a lot of universities, and Liberty put in a lot of FOI requests. And some wily old and ancient universities didn't answer the FOI requests. They could get away with it. My favourite part of the Sky News website, when you click on it, is when you click on the Oxford Brookes entry, and it said Oxford Brookes did answer the FOI requests and also revealed everything that my university was also doing. Right? So there was no point in my university having refused to answer the FOI request for security reasons. And you can all see what was happening. What private security firms have been involved. What messages were going between the police and university officials. Now, you may be interested in this. Most people are not. But the management of universities are acutely interested in it. They're terrified. Absolutely terrified of being found out. They are terrified also of a mob they imagine that doesn't exist. They behave in various ways because they are so dislocated from reality that they see out there thousands and thousands of activists that you could only dream of recruiting. But this is partly why they behave. Let me take you forward to yesterday. Of the things you might not think are possible. I'm from the city of Oxford. We had a different story of our councillors. Two resigned immediately upon the leader of the Labour Party saying it was okay to deny people water. In particular, another 6 went a few days later. Before we knew it, Labour no longer controlled the city of Oxford. Many Labour MPs signed a pledge about ceasefire. Our MP didn't. Annalise Dodds, Labour MP for Oxford East, wrote a very long letter saying how complicated everything was. And a lot of us wrote letters to Annalise saying, grow a spine, essentially. Now, something happened in the Oval Office yesterday, which is why you don't know this, or you probably don't. Annalise Dodds resigned yesterday as a member of the government. Right? Writing letters does have an effect. These people are not immune to the pressure that comes from their constituents, from others around them. You can put on pressure on people and it has an effect. What is going to happen next? My best guess. There is disunity in the management of universities. I know that because I can see it because I'm up in there. And people talk or whisper to me about what's going on and worried partly about their reputations, partly about morality over what they're doing. There is disunity in the cabinet. Annalise Dodds will not be the first. You have 400 MPs elected on a lower vote than Labour won in 2019. They are highly nervous and many of them do not like the direction of travel. So a huge amount could happen, and I don't think you should be surprised by seeing it happen. The key thing we should remember, in my view, is that the far right are emboldened in the United States. I think it was 5 of the 7 richest men in the planet who stood behind Trump in his inauguration. They're emboldened, they've won, and they want their next prize. And their next prize is not Canada, it's not Mexico, and it's not Panama, and it's not Greenland, and it isn't even the rare earth metals in Ukraine. The next prize for the richest men on earth is the United Kingdom. It's London. That's what they want. And they want it because they're so closely connected to this country in their lives. This country was the centre, is the centre still, for the far-right think tanks of Europe. They're clustered around Tufton Street. When we left the EU, the next largest cluster of far-right think tanks was in Warsaw. And their Adam Smith Institute employed less than a dozen people. Right? London is the centre for the rich men's dream of the kind of society that they want. And Sunak called the election early because he could see how quickly reform were gaining power and support with the sponsorship of those men. And so, in a sense, we are back to 1938. And we're back to the black shirts. We're back to posh men like Mosley, who can raise rabbles. But we're also back to a period where politics really matters. Because if Labour fail to build homes for people, if they fail to contain Thames Water and the bills, if they fail to even repair 40 hospitals, the repercussion isn't just another Conservative administration and Labour will be back in 2 or 3 terms. The repercussion is allowing the most far-right, serious political party in Europe to gain power. The Conservative Party left the European bloc in 2014 and joined an alliance with the AWD in Germany, the far right. Our Conservative Party have already moved that far. Reform are to the right of the far right, and Labour MPs, Labour activists, even in the Labour machine, know this, and they know that they could be the government which is remembered in history for handing the UK that far. They need to be reminded of that. It is that dangerous a situation that we are currently in, and I would just remember how the students in 1938, even the posh ones, Iris Murdoch and Dennis Healy from Bradford Boys' School, they played their part. They did things, and the things they did actually mattered. Thank you very much for listening.